Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everyone to a conversation with Dr. Faith Kearns, who is the author of this book that you see in front of you, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication. Dr. Faith Kearns is at the California Institute for Water Resources, and I'm thrilled that Dr. Faith Kearns is joining us today. My name is Michael Schenk. As you know, I am the co-director currently of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and we're thrilled to be featuring these authors from Island Press in these informal chats, conversations. So Dr. Faith Kearns, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Michael. I look forward to the conversation.
All right, so I've had an opportunity to watch your presentations. They're excellent. And I've taken some slides from your presentation. We're just gonna tick through a few of them because I'm very keen to hear you explain your thinking here. And I'm also very keen to have our cities integrate some of your wisdom. So the first, this whole idea that we should move away from the sage on the stage. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. So, a lot of communication efforts have really been focused on what's called sort of the deficit model, this idea that if people just had enough or the right information, they would take some kind of action. And so there's been a huge focus on just sort of presenting information to people. And I think what we found over time is that it doesn't actually work all that well. Of course, information is really important, but sort of as a theory of change, just delivering information to people generally doesn't work in terms of seeing the kinds of changes that we want to see.
Got it. So this unidirectional monologue of the scientist on the stage we need to move away from. What then in short do we move to? And that's where we're getting to with your book. But like what is your elevator pitch in terms of what do we need to transition to instead?
Yeah, so my overall theory is that, relationships are really important and communication is a part of a relationship. And so we've sort of been focusing on the more micro scale versus the macro scale in terms of thinking about relationship. And that means that information is definitely not unidirectional. And I would even argue it's not just bidirect, it's not just two-way either. It's actually an incredibly multi-directional ecosystem that we're all involved in.
Yeah, as you said in a presentation, we'll get to a slide about this shortly, but as you said in a presentation, which I really liked, when we think of, I'm going to put this in quotes because I know you probably don't like the phrase either, but winning the hearts and minds and this behavior change agenda that is really much more a relationship agenda. And I'm adding words by calling it an agenda, but it's really about relationship versus
Yeah.
somehow winning the hearts and minds with good communication.
Yeah, and for me, I don't even like to think a lot about behavior change because I'm actually questioning the entire sort of paradigm of an expert class that sort of knows better than everybody else and knows the kinds of behaviors that everybody else should have, right? So I actually am sort of suggesting a wholesale change that involves those of us who consider ourselves to have some expertise in a certain topic to actually consider ourselves to be sort of part of the overall mess that we're all involved in, and to think about relationship as the way forward without necessarily an answer in mind.
So what do you say to actors, stakeholders like cities, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, that are super busy, and when you say something like, this is a relationship challenge versus a behavior change or communications or winning the hearts and minds challenge, that seems like a lot of time needed to do that. That's the long game. And with something like the climate crisis, we have to act now, not 10 years, and relationships take time. How do you respond to that?
I definitely understand it. I mean, I think our work cycles, our funding cycles, all of those things are not set up to do the kind of relational work that I think is really necessary. And I absolutely understand the time crunch. And yet I think all of the other things that we have tried have not necessarily worked either. And so taking a step back and taking the time to think about this as a relational issue really feels like, to me, one of the only ways forward that we've got at this point.
I agree. And I think our cities, not to speak for them, but I think our cities are realizing the limits on what they've tried in terms of traditional communications and
Yeah.
community engagement. And I think they're very interested in trying something new, and they recognize what they've tried before hasn't worked. So we have to do this. This is our only choice to try this new approach.
Agreed.
All right, well, let's jump into some slides here from your presentation. And when you talk about complexity, can you explain what you mean by this slide?
Yeah, so just to get back to this idea that, we've really focused on sort of one-way communication and information delivery. And instead, I think, people have started to realize that what we're really involved in here is this big sort of communication relationship ecosystem where lots of people are not only in conversation with us, but they're in conversation with
Mm,
lots of other people in various sort of places and configurations. And all of that is really, really complex. And I do understand that it's really challenging. It's really hard to get past that one way model. Even myself, as a practicing science communicator, I default to it with regularity because it is such a sort of standard and the way our workday and work life is set up way of doing things. And yeah, I just feel strongly that we need to be sort of considering this ecosystem that we're all a part of.
yeah, that you visualize very nicely here. The reason why I wanted to have slides up is that you've got some great visuals, and the lesson is implicit in the visual. So this here versus the sage on the stage that you had previously. All right, so challenging the reliance on scientific authority. I think we're finally moving away from that globally. For the last 10, 20, 30 years, there was an emphasis on the climate data, the climate science, and the scientists who overwhelmingly agree that this is the direction we're headed, these data are true, etc. So we have relied on scientific authority because that was the big win that we needed to win the policymakers' hearts and minds globally. I have encouraged our cities to move away from the data and the science and the scientists. Can you talk about how we transition? Because if you look at the quote here, which I think is really powerful, there's been this divestment of emotional and human connection, and now we need to get back to it. We need to move away from trying to rest solely and solidly in the science and the scientists and really
Mhm.
connect. How do you coach and encourage leaders, thought leaders, to make that transition? Because that's a big ask. It's an important one. It's a big ask.
It is, and I will say, I'm not asking everyone to do this. I don't think it's necessarily well suited for everyone, but I do think that there are a large number of us, myself included, who absolutely feel comfortable operating in a more sort of emotional and, as Dr. Myrie says here, mortal human realm.
Mm,
In 2015 or so, I wrote an article in New Republic that was basically about this idea that we had already sort of proven the scientific case around climate change. And instead, what needed to happen was sort of the bringing in of social movements. And I think
mm,
over the past, say, 7 years, that's something that has absolutely happened, largely due to work by people like Dr. Myrie to kind of step outside of this idea of a very honestly sort of patriarchal and authoritative sense of the role of science in society, and sort of say, again, as I sort of said, we're all in this mess together,
mm.
and scientists don't necessarily have all the clues for how we are going to make a societal transition, right? So that's again where I focus on the idea of relationship versus authority.
Yeah.
So it puts us back in this sort of more messy and chaotic realm of complexity. But again, what we've been doing hasn't borne the changes that we need to see, and so why not try something different?
Yeah, and Faith, I think that's your strongest argument. It hasn't brought about the changes that we've needed and we need now, and so this is an opportune time to try something new. I also appreciate, and we'll see this through your slides, how you are lifting up so many different voices in this space. So thank you. I just wanted to thank you for bringing in so many voices into this. Standing in the gap. So this is really interesting. We can provide accurate information, but there's also got to be somebody standing in the gap prepared to support them through their emotions around how it feels to be corrected. Let's talk about what that means, standing in the gap.
Yeah, so Mila Marshall, who's a doctoral candidate at the University of Illinois, I had a really interesting conversation with her. And I think that this statement she makes is really actually very profound when we think about communication, because in this case, she was talking about the idea of dis or misinformation and sort of saying that, people are told a set of information by people that they love and respect. And where you're going to go up against challenging that, you actually kind of need to be there in an emotional, connective sense to sort of hold the space while they are processing that people they love might have given them some amount of dis or misinformation, right? And
Yeah.
this kind of statement, again, profoundly challenges the kinds of communications efforts that those of us who are sort of daily practitioners have been sort of raised up to do, right? The idea that it would partly be your job to sort of be an emotional, rock for people as they move through, experiencing new information is super interesting and I think very important.
Well, this goes back to this reaffirms your point about relationships and how critical they are because if you have a relationship, you will be inclined to stand in the gap. And if you don't have a relationship, it will be impossible to stand in the gap. So,
Exactly, right?
yeah,
Like this statement is actually not possible without thinking about relationship
that's
first.
right. That's right. That's right. And as you note here, and I'd love for you to just talk through what we're seeing here, but as you
Mhm.
know, these are emotional topics in times, and people are really struggling, certainly post COVID, and thus the need for a relationship. So, talk us through what we're seeing.
Yeah. So again, going back to this idea of relying sort of on scientific authority and thinking about, in this case, I'm talking about science communication practitioners, but I think communication practitioners in general are operating in this space where there's just a ton of conflict and emotion. And we tend to, especially in the science realm, sort of push that down with the idea that people should deal with these things in a rational way, right? So I deal with particularly water and drought, wildfire, climate change issues in the state of California. And these are very emotional, obviously, often contentious and sometimes traumatic issues. And so, sort of not recognizing that's the realm in which you're practicing your communications work seems, really counterproductive to me. And I think the one thing that has made the reality of what I'm talking about clear to a lot more people is COVID, right? Just seeing the emotion, the conflict, the trauma, the complexity that came with what a lot of people probably felt like was a fairly straightforward issue of something like masks, just has proven, I think, the case that we really need to be taking the emotional space more seriously.
Have you found other institutions? I grew up in the church, and so my mind was going there quickly as we
Mhm.
talk about mortality. Other institutions that have dealt with heavy issues, emotional issues, that do the kind of job you're calling for in terms of relationally holding people through pretty scary times. Have you seen that elsewhere work?
Yeah, I mean, and partly it overlaps with some of the work that I'm trying to do. I will say I've seen the sort of psychotherapy community, move in a direction of utilizing the kinds of tools that they have, which I think are very can be very good at dealing with these kinds of things into a more sort of socially oriented space. So I rely a lot and look toward what sort of psychoanalytic communities are doing. I do think some religious institutions are very good about dealing with this kind of thing. I certainly have colleagues who are working on climate change issues in various types of religious communities. And I do see organizations, local, all kinds of, particularly local organizations who are dealing with the sort of downstream effects of, say, wildfires and climate change, who are really, really having to adapt to the deep emotional and sort of traumatic effect of some of these issues on people. And I've also seen it with things that might seem as basic as drought in California that are really starting to spur some mental health crises that local, even some farming organizations are having to take quite seriously.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's continue on with some of your slides here. And I wanted to keep this slide in because I'm encouraging our cities to storytell as much as possible. And so this creation of stories here I thought was really appropriate to talk about. Can you speak to this? And I just want our cities to note the appreciative approach here in terms of plant appreciation and just making it fun and how critical that is to balancing our work in this space. You want to speak to this slide in particular?
Sure. So, Dr. Malika Noko is a good colleague of mine. We host a podcast together, and she's really a great scientist and is super fun. And she and some colleagues were working on a really challenging issue around analyzing some public comments on conservation issues. And after doing that for a week, they basically were like, "How can we interact with this information in a way that helps us sort of again move from joy to despair?" As the top of the slide says. And, Malika is somebody who is quite funny and makes a lot of puns. And so this was really an outlet. And actually, quite a few scientists, naturalists have contributed their stories of how much they love plants. And I do think that Dr. Noko actually did the first one talking about tomatoes and her love for tomatoes and how that connected her with all sorts of things. And so I do think that, even though these are really challenging issues, there are a lot of places where we can think about, joy in these movements, right?
Yeah, and nourishing, how important it is to nourish ourselves and fill up our well in this space. All right, going back to your relationship comment and something we've already said, this is more of a relationship challenge than a communication challenge. This is more of a relationship, as I get tongue twisted on it, than a communication challenge. So talk us through what you've listed here in terms of what we're seeing.
Yeah. So again, it reiterates some of the points I've made in terms of thinking about this idea that, we are in a relationship, we are equals, rather than sort of being this idea of being an objective expert, which is, very strong in a lot of sort of scientific communities, but lots of other, expert communities. And so the idea for me is much more that, we're in a relationship, in a conversation about how things can unfold in a different way. And the most important piece for me, and really where I started with this work, was that so much communications work, and again, particularly in the sciences, was really about this idea of presenting and sort of performing scientific authority. And we never ever talked about listening, which is really fascinating for communicators, right? To not think about that other side of things. And so I really tried to focus in the book on this idea of how to listen deeply, and to not treat it in a facile way. I think we can often see these things that are like, we're going to do a listening tour and we want to do a community listening session, but I tried to go really into the complexity of what it means to listen well and with accountability, right? And part of that means, as a practitioner, becoming very comfortable with sort of the emotions that can come up when you are listening well, because it can often create a lot of internal to yourself conflict, right? When you're coming up against ideas that are very different than your own. So it's really a full body effort to learn how to listen well.
When you think of trust in elected officials, and there's a range for our cities. Some cities are really struggling with low trust. Some cities have high trust. When you think of a genuine listening experience and space, have you found that third parties are best to facilitate, or is it okay, as we think about cities and creating quality space for listening? Because a lot of our cities are rolling out citizen assemblies and appreciative inquiry processes. Some are doing virtual engagement, and with trust as the added variable there, how have you found the most optimal space for that? Facilitated by a third party? No, not necessary.
Yeah, so trust is a really, really complicated topic, right? But in terms of this idea of listening, I can go either way. Like, I think it really depends on the goal of what it is that you're trying to do and who is doing the listening work. So, for example, I think that you can actually derail trust efforts by trying to do a listening process where folks aren't actually particularly adept at listening. So, that could come in the form of a skilled facilitator for sure. I think that can be a super important intervention setup. But I also think it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, particularly if you can train, which I do want to emphasize that training actually works in these situations, train people to listen better. The other thing I think is really important is understanding the limits of what you're able to do with what you hear, right? So I think that's where a lot of trust efforts can go sideways, is that there isn't a clear setup around the actual boundaries of what anybody who's listening in any situation is actually able to accomplish. So I think being very transparent about what you can actually do with what you hear is really, really important.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so Dr. Melanie Yahtzee is amazing. I talked to her a few years ago about this idea that she coined this term of called radical relationality, which was really just this idea of, as she says, this indigenous understanding of kinship and simply being a good relative, right? We don't often think about our interactions, particularly professionally, of being about being that kind of relation, right? And so what she was saying is that this is actually radical because it is so different from how we normally conduct, particularly our professional relationships. And so it really is something that I try to, again, in my book, emphasize. There's these long cultural traditions and certainly professional traditions of learning how to listen, learning how to relate better. And we can learn from all of those. This is not new work. Lots of people have been doing it for a long time.
Yeah. I can think of my practice relationally as a service model, where I frame my efforts around being in service to others. It means I can't come at it from a place of being an expert with all the answers. So the true definition, as we think about cities, of public servant and civil servant. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Theopia Jackson is one of my touchstones, a clinical psychologist. And I think this idea of a service model is of benefit to a lot of folks who tend to not necessarily think of it that way, but also to have a deep inquiry about what it means to be of service, right? Because again, these can become these sort of colloquial terms that we use that don't hold a lot of meaning. And so interrogating them occasionally is helpful.
Yeah. Focus on needs and strengths. Where have we focused in the past? You know, I think a lot about appreciative inquiry, because the city of Cleveland has done some work on appreciative inquiry and moving away from the problem-solving approach to an appreciative approach, which is a shift for a lot of cities, because problem solving is so clear and rational. What's the problem? Let's solve it. And I think in the climate space, that's been the focus as we build out our climate action plans. What's the problem? Let's solve it. Here's the plan. These are the targets and timelines. Talk a little bit about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, so this was a project with Dr. Mike Antos and others where they were looking at how water providers can help better serve their users. And this was in a very urban area of Riverside County and beyond in Southern California. And so the idea was that, you know, instead of just looking at what people need, which is, you know, considered to sort of be, again, that sort of regressive model, because communities also obviously have their strengths as well. And then they also developed this really interesting ethnographic listening process where they actually developed it and then trained people to use it so that they could start to reach actually folks that, again, in some of these spheres, homeowners are a huge, you know, target of all our efforts at the city level, right? And they were really trying to get at, you know, for example, what is the homeless population in their county and their watershed need? And so they sort of they had to center listening because the folks who often are making these decisions have no experience of what it's like to be a homeless water user in, you know, Southern California. And so this was a super interesting process where they were really also trying to say these communities have a lot to offer as well.
Yeah. And it sounds like, based on how you're presenting these voices, that this process was very informative for you too, as a facilitator of this knowledge, sharing it out. And I know in your other presentations you thank and recognize and give gratitude to a lot of these actors that we're seeing here on the page.
Yeah, my book would not have been possible without being able to have so many examples from folks who are already doing such great work on the ground.
Yeah. We know this to be true with our cities, and our cities are finally scaling up the necessary services in this space. Is there anything else to add here other than what's obvious, what we see?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just really interesting where, you know, they published a a paper on the results of this listening study, that listening work that they did, and found some really interesting things, including this issue around language, but lots of other things as well. They found what they called a series of disconnections, right? So where are the places where we start to be connected and then the disconnection comes in? And this was certainly one of them, right? But there were multiple others. And in fact, that the process that they went through surfaced lots of other areas in which they need to do a listening process as well, right? Lots of answers, but lots more questions.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to study during the conversation where the disconnect happens and then to study why. Ethically listening. Let's talk about this.
Yeah. So Dr. Yana Lembrenadu, one of my favorite colleagues, the only person I have ever known who's taught listening to scientists and engineers at the collegiate level, is someone who I really respect, done a lot of work on the Flint water crisis, and led in water in Washington, D.C. as well. And so she really has some on the ground experience, as well as her academic training, that sort of has lent to this sense that for her, we really need these listening processes to be ground in ethical frameworks. And this is, again, something where I think our very sort of colloquial conversations about what a listening process looks like can fall off the rails, because, she's really saying that in a, say, a city listening process, the city has a lot of power, right? And so we need to acknowledge that power differential is there, and that there are ways that you can extract information from communities without going back and helping them at all, right? Or completely distort what you've been told. And so Yana is really the person who provided a moral compass around the listening work throughout the book, for sure.
I'm excited for our cities to read this book. And thank you for making that city example. That was very clear. Being comfortable with discomfort. What a proposal. Yes, I fully agree. Let's talk about this. What you mean here?
Yeah, so this is a colleague of mine who works on climate change, or he works with ranchers in Hawaii, and was really concerned about how to talk about climate change with those often very conservative communities. And he basically, when I was talking about some of what I'm talking about with you, he stood up and at first I thought he was actually going to tell me that I was very wrong about what I was saying, but he actually sort of stood up and said, wow, I had not thought about the ethics of sort of not telling people about climate change, right? He was very worried about actually disrupting the long-term relationships he had with the people he worked with by talking about climate change. And instead, he started to see it as, and he basically said at that time, I would hate in 10 years for the folks that I work with to come back to me and say, Mark, why didn't you talk to us about climate change? Because it's affecting our operations, and you didn't tell us anything about it. And again, I think he speaks to this idea of how important the relational model is, because he's basically saying within that framework of thinking about long-term working relationships, hopefully they can handle some conflict in talking about these very difficult topics, right? We all know how hard it is to talk about things that can disrupt our relationships, right? But the idea is also that if there is a deep relationship there, we can work through conflict. That is definitely the hope. And I've certainly seen it happen myself as someone who started out very conflict averse.
Nicely stated. Yes, this reaffirms this notion that the relationship is essential, because without it, the conflict will disrupt it pretty significantly. Yeah, significantly. Equity, inclusion, and justice. This, as I mentioned in another conversation with you, Faith, is very much the focus of our cities. And I would just love to hear what you heard in working on this for your book.
Yeah, so I heard a lot. There's a whole chapter in the book just focused on this arena, although also the whole book is a fairly justice oriented work. And so Dr. Avila, who is a great colleague of mine, again said something I think is so profound, which is that we sort of create this technical language, and certainly cities, have this sort of technocratic way of approaching issues, and that language that we use can actually exclude people. people, right? I certainly see that in my work every day on water issues,
Mm.
where we all understand how important water is, and yet the language we use can make it seem very technocratic and abstract, right? And then he's sort of saying, and then we have to say we're the experts, and we're gonna simplify out this language we created for you, right?
Right.
And then I think that does lead into this idea of this one-way communication, and we're explaining things to people. What I find in my everyday work is that people are so wise and know
Mm.
so much already, and so not approaching it from that perspective that everybody has a lot of wisdom to share, I think is not doing us any favors at all. And so I think if we can sort of again take very seriously what he is saying, it really has a profound effect on how we think about communications.
Yes, 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 and yes. We definitely struggle with this in the climate space with deep decarbonization
Yeah.
and carbon neutrality and net zero emissions. And that internal language then becomes external language, and we just canonize it and wonder why people aren't tracking with it. And so, yeah.
Right, and then pay people to explain it, right? So yeah, it's
Right. That's
worth
exactly
thinking
right.
about.
Yeah. So, Faith, I'm so thankful for this entire conversation. In thinking about how to integrate all of this, because as our cities are watching this, I know our cities are thinking about a lot of this. What are some of the first steps as we build relationship? That's the big theme here, because a lot of the strategies, and you may not see listening as a strategy, but I'm adding my language here, but a lot of those strategies are dependent upon a good relationship. And
Mhm.
so what's your charge to stakeholders like cities in the relationship building space that they can take away? And I'm very keen. Our last slide is the picture of your book, which I'm very keen for our cities to buy and to read and to dive into. But yeah, any thoughts here in terms of next steps?
Yeah, so here I'm speaking, fairly specifically. I like to kind of stay in my lane, so to speak. And so I'm talking, really about sort of technical research-based science communication, where I personally, that's the realm I've been in for 25 years or so. And it has felt very stagnant, in all honesty, for most of that time. And so what I tried to end this work on was this idea of what more is possible if we sort of reimagine our work as more relational and more just, right? With the idea of just inspiring folks to think about some of the things that we can start to tell ourselves are just the way they are, right?
Right.
And so, some of the things, again, I think we can focus on are relationship first, right? That model of relationship first. And I know it's very challenging. It takes patience and it takes work. And yet I really think that's where we have to focus. Listening, thinking about the ethics of all of this kind of work and how to not be extractive, how to actually do justice-oriented work that is perceived as fair and just by the recipients of that
Mm,
work, which is truly all of us. We all live here, right?
mm.
So thinking about it that way, and those are just a few of the tenets that I try to put forward, and basically, urge people as much as they can in the space that they are working in, which, there's so many places people are working that I could never imagine myself. And so trying to have people do a deep inquiry around their own work to just sort of try to reimagine what more is possible.
I love this. As you were talking about extractive approaches in the science communication space, we talk a lot of extractive fossil fuels and the need to
Yes.
pivot to and transition to regenerative. So we talk about the problem with extraction in the fossil fuel space, the need to pivot to regenerative. But I haven't heard a lot of conversation, maybe you have because you're very much in this space, much more than I, but regenerative communication, regenerative
I have not heard
communication
that phrase,
styles.
and actually, Michael, I love it. We should make that happen.
Yeah, because our cities and the stakeholders in this space are definitely talking about regenerative economies and regenerative agriculture. And so they're tracking with that language already. And let's
Mhm.
layer on, and maybe Faith, this is where you and I should co-author something on this. But yeah, this regenerative engagement, regenerative communication, because they would understand it. Well, this
Yeah,
is a
no,
this is a,
that's a
this is a fun
beautiful.
aha moment. This is good.
Yeah, I tend to use the word generative, but I like the idea of regenerative,
Mm.
communication. That's actually a fantastic way of putting it that fits in. I agree with you with the way a lot of folks are already talking. So
Well, Faith, what a great conversation. Here's the book. And if folks want to keep in touch, here's Faith's website and Twitter and newsletter. And really encourage you to go to Island Press and check out this book. Faith, thank you so much for your time today and your work in this space. It's so invaluable.
thank you so much, Michael. It was a great joy to talk with you.
All right, thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. We'll continue to talk with authors in this space. And thanks for hanging out. Follow up, check out her book, check out her website, and we'll talk more soon.